Hello and welcome to this video on project organization. In this demo, we'll learn about breaking down a complex process into smaller workflows. We'll start from a pre-built project organized as a single workflow file and break it down based on its functionality and the ability to test and reuse individual components. Let's begin. Let's have a look at our starting project. We'll go through the used functionality, sequences and variables, and see if we can spot any opportunities to optimize our project by reusing parts of workflows. The project is a flowchart that enters new account data into the Acme website. Once the automation is executed, the user chooses one of three input types. First, we have manual input, where the data is entered in a form by the user. Next, we have file input, where the user data is downloaded from the Acme website. And finally, stop, which ends the workflow execution. We store the user's input into the user choice string variable. Moving on, in the main flowchart, we have a flow switch activity, which directs the execution based on the user choice. If the user selects manual input, a UiPath form is displayed, which contains the same input fields as the Acme application. Let's click Open Form Designer to see what the form looks like. The collection property contains the mapping between the form fields and the variables where the input is stored. Note that each UiPath form field has a field key, which is used to pass user-entered data to the workflow variables at runtime. Now let's say that the user chooses File Input, an input dialog box to select the relevant dataset file to read data from. And finally, if the user chooses Stop, a message box, Execution Stopped by User, is displayed, and the execution is terminated. The next step is the application initialization sequence, which opens the browser, navigates to the Acme website, and checks the login status. The login sequence is initiated if the user is not already logged in. Now let's look at the manual input branch. The user enters data manually in the UiPath form. Most of the steps for the file input branch are similar to the ones in the manual input branch. The difference here is that we have a download dataset activity. After downloading it, we use a read range activity to read the data from the file. Next, the workflow follows the same method of input data in the Acme website as in the manual input branch, except that it uses a different source, the input data table. Great! Now that we understand the workflow, let's see how we can break the process into smaller workflows. Based on our review, we can tell that the workflow is very complex for a single file. It's not easy to test, and it does contain some redundant sequences. We can improve it by extracting the login and data entry sequences as individual workflow files. First, we'll convert the login sequence into a separate workflow. To do that, we'll right-click on the Login to Acme sequence and select Extract as Workflow and click Create. The newly created workflow is opened in a new tab. Going back to main, we can notice that we have an Invoke Workflow activity, which invokes the newly created workflow. Moving on, we notice that the sequence of type into activities is duplicated for the manual and file input. We'll extract this sequence as a workflow to remove the redundancy. Great! We can see the arguments have already been created. We only need to rename them according to our best practices. Let's save the workflow. Now let's configure the mapping between the field entry workflow arguments and the variables in main. Let's click Import Arguments for the new Invoke Workflow activity. We'll now map the arguments to their corresponding variables. Moving on, the file input sequence uses the same steps to enter the data in Acme as the manual input sequence. Since we now have a reusable component for these steps, let's go ahead and use it. We'll remove the Use Application or Browser activity inside the For Each and replace it with the Field Entry Workflow. Note that we should be mapping the arguments to the cells in the extracted data table instead of the workflow variables in this case. Great! We've broken down the project into smaller workflows. Let's save and run it. For the first run, we'll select Manual Input. Add the data manually and click Submit. The Login to Acme workflow executes, and we access the page. We can reuse this workflow in other projects as well. The data is entered in Acme using the Field Entry workflow. For the second run, we'll select File Input and click OK. This input method will download the data set from the Acme website as a local file and then read it to populate the user form. The field entry workflow is used here as well. The third option, Stop, will end the workflow execution. And that was all for today. For a quick recap, organizing projects into smaller workflows provides many benefits, like the ability to test workflows individually, reusability, decreased development time, and easier maintenance. Sequences in a large project can be extracted as individual workflows, which can then be called using Invoke Workflow. When using the extractor's workflow action, the variables are automatically converted to arguments. Thanks for watching and happy automation!